Hello, biology class. We are going to do a new chapter here, chapter 5, and we'll cram the whole thing into this last week before break. So we're going backwards here because I feel like the next thing we will do that involves the evolution and groups of animals, like population-wise, I think we need this as a foundation for it. There's a lot of really good information in here, and it's pretty easy to understand. It's a nice kind of lower level tier thing before we get into, before you go away for actual spring break here, right? So we can just get started. The first part is on how populations grow. Sorry. So the first way we describe populations is through their geographic range, which just means a description of where you find an organism, and we usually represent this with maps. So if you'll recall, an organism or organisms evolve to fit their environment. By fit, we just mean that they are successful in their environment. Apart from flying animals and many ocean-going animals, most have a pretty limited range because there's geographic isolation. There are factors that keep an organism from being able to move around. It can be mountain ranges. It can be the fact you live on an island. It can be many, many, many things. But food is one of the really important things. So plants are the base for any kind of food system in an ecosystem. And plants are, they're even more limited because they depend on the climate, which varies greatly from place to place. Now, many animals eat more than just one kind of plant or one kind of animal or whatever, so they can spread out better than plants can. But when you look at the ranges that organisms have, actually quite a few of them are fairly limited. So here's an example, the snow leopard. They only live in these regions highlighted in the orange. That's a pretty large region, but if we looked at the entire map of the world, we'd say, well, no, they just kind of live in this one corner. And it's also a very specialized environment. This is extreme high elevation, right? Tibet is a region of China, and it's like the highest. It's not its own country, but like if it were, it would be the country with the overall highest elevation, like on average, right? So they only lives in mountains and colder areas. A really extreme example of this is what's called the Texas cave salamander. It's called that because they only live in Texas in caves, and they actually only live in one county in Texas. I don't remember what the county is, but that's the only place we've ever been able to find them. So they are extremely specialized. What's crazy about them is because they live in caves, if you look closely at the animal, they don't have eyes. They live in perpetual darkness, so they have lost that trait, like the way snakes have lost their legs because they don't need them anymore. Islands are really good examples. So here we see an entire globe, and so what are called the old world monkeys, which there are many different types of old world monkeys: apes, orangutans, gorillas, chimpanzees, and such. So they live in all the green areas. One of them, the tarsiers, only live on a few islands, though, which would be like Borneo and Sumatra and the Philippines and a few others. If we look at lemurs, there are many different species of lemur, but all of them collectively only live in Madagascar, right? And then New World monkeys, which are different, like spider monkeys. One of the big differences is New World monkeys, their nostrils actually come out the sides of their nose and not the bottom. They only live in South and Central America, right? If we take a look at an animal with a huge geographic distribution, well, the blue whale lives in all these areas highlighted in blue, right? The oceans are, they're not exactly the same everywhere, but they're much more similar than land, and the barriers really aren't that extreme, right? So there's nothing stopping a whale from swimming all the way across the Pacific Ocean. but it would be extremely difficult for an animal to walk all the way across Europe and Asia, right? There are barriers in place. Now, this doesn't mean that every blue whale will, during its life, swim around to every single point in the ocean on the planet. No. One population of whales only hangs out maybe in like the northern Atlantic, but a different group of the same species, there's still blue whales, hangs out in the southern Atlantic, and then another in the southern Pacific, northern Pacific, what have you. A key to understanding geographic distribution is we're talking about one singular species, right? So if you Google, for example, what is the geographic distribution of pigeons? You get the map on the bottom left. And we can see that almost the entire world is colored green. However, there are many species of pigeons. I don't know how many off the top of my head. I should have looked that up. But, so for example, this is called the three-banded pigeon, I believe, or three-striped pigeon. I think it's banded. Their geographic distribution is on the map on the right side here, right? So I believe the orange area is their breeding area, and then the purplish areas are their, like, permanent residence. So that's way more limited than the entire globe, right? Because there are many species of pigeon. Okay, next is growth rate. So growth rate can be positive, negative, or it can be stable. In general, habitats that are not heavily influenced by human activity, which are becoming increasingly rare, and habitats that don't have any invasive species have stable growth rates, right? Because organisms evolve alongside each other. For every prey, there is a certain number of predators that keep them balanced, and vice versa. For every kind of plant, there's a few animals that will eat it, so on and so on and so on. They all live in harmony together, right? But human activity tends to make many native species experience negative growth rates. But some animals thrive in cities that have positive growth rates. So like raccoons and pigeons and rats and mice, especially rats and mice, they are hugely successful because they're opportunists and they take advantage of all of our garbage and stuff that we produce, and we produce tons of that stuff. So they're doing very well. And then also, humans sometimes accidentally or on purpose introduce invasive species that then all of a sudden are very successful. We've also hunted many animals to extinction. Oops. But we are now actively trying to recover many animal species. So we're trying to correct for some of that, but there's still, overall, the number of species on our planet is plummeting year after year. There are huge numbers of extinctions happening for very complicated reasons. So, for example, in Yellowstone National Park, a long time ago, when we did ecology, we watched the really good video about wolves in Yellowstone, and all the wolves disappeared, and the elk population soared, but it made other populations, even down to the animals that lived in the lake, like the trout, go down for very complicated reasons that I won't get into. So when the wolves were introduced back into the park in the early 90s, mid-90s, we can see that because there were so many elk, because there weren't predators that hunted them, or there weren't any wolves at least, the wolf population shot way up because it's like, oh man, look at all this food. But, you know, elk usually don't give birth to more than 1 or 2 calves every year. And so their replacement rate, is not really all that high. So then the wolf population came down, but then we can see this projects into the future, but we have a stabilizing number where the wolf population is going to hit a point where it's flat. It's really, it'll wiggle up and down year to year, but it's not going to go way up or way down. And then same story for the elk. This next graph shows, these are for different groups of animals, what the risk of extinction is like for them. So fishes and gastropods and birds, and I don't know why dragonflies are specifically on there, not much of a risk, right? But we can see at the bottom, where it's especially bad on our planet is with corals because of the acidification of the oceans from the oceans absorbing our excess greenhouse or excess carbon dioxide, and from the fact that the oceans are getting hotter. Corals are just very fragile, and so, I mean, in 100 years, there may not be any coral reefs on the planet at all, which I think would be a disaster. Would it be good for humans? I mean, maybe, kind of, but you could argue that it would be bad for humans for many different ways. And amphibians are doing really bad as well because a warming planet is a planet that is drying out in a lot of areas, and amphibians require water for their life cycle, right? So they're getting hit hard too. And then one of the major things we do besides hunting and carbon dioxide emissions or whatever is the fact that we just take away habitats from animals. This picture of this koala is kind of famous. He's just sitting there going, "Where'd my home go?" And it's easy to feel very sympathetic and sad for the koala. We have to cut down trees well, we don't have to, but we are cutting down trees in order to expand agriculture and several other things. And this is really hitting species that live in tropical areas hard because we have to grow things like palm oil, which can only grow in tropical climates, and it's in so many consumer products, especially like junk foods and stuff. But it's really bad because we get rid of the habitat for the native species, and then they go extinct. No time to be sad. Moving on. Density and distribution. So population density is just a way to describe how many organisms you can find in a certain area. So you might do square mile or square kilometer, or you might do square meter, right? Because some animals are tiny, and so you wouldn't want to count how many of them are in a square mile because you would get a number with so many zeros that we don't even have a name for it. It's like 100 zeros or something. But population density never tells the whole story. So, for example, there are around 10 billion bacteria in a gram of soil, right? But the bacteria are so small that we still can't see them. That's a healthy amount of bacteria because that's the amount of bacteria that naturally exists in soil. The most numerous animal on the planet is the nematode. Nematodes are also called roundworms, and I shouldn't have done that because they're extremely microscopic. You can't see them. A square foot, if you just go out in your yard and analyze an area this big, you wouldn't probably have the equipment to do it, but you'll find you will find more than 25,000 of these things per square foot, right? So a very small number of apex predators, especially an invasive species, can wipe out a very large area of most of its prey. That's why population density doesn't tell the whole story. Because a predator can be few in number, but they cover a huge area and they just gobble up everything that's around them, right? And that can be really bad for the environment. A population distribution describes the way that individuals are spaced out. So what do I mean by this? Well, there's three types. There's random, uniform, and clumped. So plants tend to grow randomly, and we'll look at this with visuals. And animals tend to either clump or be uniform. So what do I even mean? Well, a uniform distribution is where basically the way the individuals are spaced out, they each have like their own area. The neighborhood I live in is fairly new in development, and most of the houses are like really similar. They're almost the same. They're just painted and landscaped slightly differently. And everybody has like a same or a similar portioned lot or whatever. So that's uniform. The way cities are engineered for people is not random or clumped, really. It's pretty much uniform. The random distribution, so the thing in the middle here, if you were to throw 20 darts at a dartboard, you should not expect to hit all 20 of the different little sections of a dartboard, right? No, you might get like 5 kind of in the same area, and then 3 or 4 over here, 3 or 4 over here, or whatever, and then a bunch filling in between. That's what randomness actually looks like. And clumped is where we get like herds, right? So an example that I could think of uniform distribution is what nesting birds do. On the left are albatrosses, along with like plastic fake albatrosses or ducks. It was really hard for me to get a good picture of this that didn't have a watermark on it. But these birds nest on the ground, not in trees, so they each give each other pretty much equal space around them. And then the penguins, they sit with that egg on top of their feet under their little belly pouch thing. And so they give each other, yeah, they're tightly packed, but they're giving each other pretty much the same room all around. If you walk around a forest, you'll find there'll be like 2, 3, 4 trees that grow like right next to each other. And then the area next to it, the trees are kind of spaced apart, and then some little clusters. So that's what random dispersion looks like. Plants have absolutely no consciousness, so they're not thinking about what it is they need to do. They just kind of have accidental growth, right? The reason a seed turns into a tree is because of luck, right? And then clumped distribution. A school of fish is a really great example because they'll clump together. But animals that travel in packs and herds will do this too. They do it for defense reasons and many other reasons. Predators usually have the uniform dispersion. Well, I shouldn't say usually, but a lot of predators have uniform dispersion. But they'll be clumped too, because maybe the males are solitary, but females will raise the offspring. There's age structure. So this describes not just the ages, but also the ratio of males to females. And it can be... Age structure can be helped. That should say age structure can help to determine the reproductive rate of a population. So many animals are only reproductively active for a few years. So ecologists want to know, yeah, there's like 1,000 elk in the park, but if half of them are like old beyond their breeding years, then that means that we should see the population decrease slightly over time, because many will die and there aren't all that many currently alive that are going to reproduce because they're not of the right age or anything like that. This happens with people. So on the left, we say the birth rate and population growth of Japan. So people are having fewer and fewer children in Japan, but the the death rate is, fairly constant. It kind of swoops a little bit, but the consequence of that is on the right side, we can see that the population of Japan is actually decreasing, and it projects into the future. But over the last several years, the population has actually been shrinking, right? Speaking of that, birth rate and death rate, these numbers put together reveal the growth rate that we just described. So birth rates and death rates are influenced by many factors. For example, a drought can wipe out a lot of the food, and then you get a high death rate. Invasive species can cause maybe not necessarily the death rate to go up, but it can cause the birth rate to go down because they outcompete, and then there's just not enough food around for organisms to be able to reproduce. Something that humans do is we go out and kill the biggest, best animals we can find. Predators avoid the biggest, best animals out there because, well, they're too risky to fight, right? But we want to hang them up on our walls and put them in our museums. So we go for the ones that have the best genetics, which is disastrous to the population of the herd. This is controlled a little bit better today, but it's still kind of a problem. And then there can be like a forest fire, and there are a huge number of things. Immigration and emigration. So both of these phenomena are actually rare in nature, but they can open up new niches and lead to speciation. When an animal is introduced, not by human influence, but when an animal just naturally is introduced to a new environment, they might see that the foods there are different, the plants there are different, the animals there are different. So they have to adjust their diet and their behavior and a lot of other things, maybe like their coat pattern, and then they differentiate. We watched the video on the finches that those two American scientists, I don't remember their names, but they randomly saw a brand new finch appear on that tiny little island they hung out at, and it eventually had several offspring and then grandkids and great-grandkids, and a new species developed from that. And there are several other documented cases of this same thing, where there are islands where like lizards or something got to that island. Lizards don't fly, so how'd they get there? Well, they must have been blown there by a storm, or they like were hanging out on a log in the ocean and it got pushed there. That's really the only explanation for it, so it does happen. And then changes in climate can allow plants and animals to spread into new areas, which we're seeing that today. So, for example, the tundra up in the Arctic, much of it is frozen all year round. But as the planet warms up, more of the ground is unfrozen throughout the year, and so trees can actually grow there. So we're actually seeing the forests, like in Canada and Alaska and Russia, grow because it's expanding into areas that are warmer than they once were. And there are other examples of that, but I don't want to talk for too long. So I keep like focusing on nature and then also focusing on human activity, which I probably shouldn't do, but whatever, this stuff is interesting. So in the United States, the fertility rate has actually been decreasing for a long time. Why are they called boomers? Well, they're called baby boomers because in the period here on the graph, you can see where that giant hump is. It was a baby boom. Women were averaging like 3 or more children there were around 3 or more children per household, right? And today it's like 1.78, I think. So the population growth was just much higher back then. But it's been going down. However, the population in the United States has not been going down because we have immigration from many, many, many different countries. Excuse me. So that can lead to the populations changing in certain areas over time. One of the other big reasons why Japan's population is decreasing is because they actually have had really strict immigration policy. They didn't really want people emigrating to their country, and now they're starting to change their mind because they're running out of people. And I guess I already mentioned this, but we're actually seeing more forests around the world because huge areas that were too cold for trees are now warm enough for trees. So if we take the birth rate, if that's constant, the population will still grow. So why is that? Well, because it takes much longer to die than it does to produce new offspring, right? Animals, the gestation period versus the lifespan period of an animal, they're like way, way, way offset, right? So, for example, I'm going to talk about humans again. The growth rate for the world has actually been decreasing ever since the 1960s, but the world population has more than doubled since then. So, unless your birth rate is 0, your population will grow, pretty much, for the most part. So here's actually the graph of that. We reached peak population growth in like 1968 or something like that, and it was only 2.1%. But we can still see that the population increased dramatically over that time. So there we go. Next is exponential growth. I need to take a drink of water. So, what about organisms that have a huge number of offspring? Well, for example, under perfect condition, a single bacteria that divides every 20 minutes, we're starting with 1. After 24 hours, after one day, it can have 4,720 quintillion descendants, which is this many, right? So 100,000, million, billion, trillion, quadrillion, quintillion. It's actually 4.7 sextillion would be the number, but I guess quintillion sounds better. So that's the number they use in the book. Now, luckily, this never happens, right? Organisms that reproduce that quickly will either have a huge number of predators, or their offspring will die just of natural causes, or they are so small and isolated, like a bacteria is, that they quickly consume all of their own resources, and then they just simply die off, right? So like oysters can release 10 or maybe like 100,000 spores or something like that. But almost all of those oyster larvae or whatever are going to die before they ever reach adulthood, right? So what about organisms that reproduce slowly? Well, what do many organisms that do this have in common? And I'm thinking in particular of mammals. Well, they tend to be huge. They live in groups, and they live for a very long time, right? So elephants, rhinos, humans. Like a human is actually a fairly large mammal. Most mammals are really, really, really small. If you think about mammals that have that breed like crazy, like mice, rats, whatever, they don't live very long. They have the huge number of offspring. They don't really live in groups necessarily. And maybe I already said this, but they have very short lifespans, right? So there are things that animals do behaviorally or whatever that work to counteract the fact that they have a slow reproduction rate. And then the book also talks about organisms in new environments. Well, many with the invasive species, they get introduced to the environment and then they very rapidly shoot dramatically up because the environment's not adapted to the animal. It's very easy to take advantage of your environment. It takes a very long time for the environment to adapt around you, right? So trees can't just start growing faster because humans are cutting them down. It's not going to happen like that. And with invasive species, it's the same kind of story. So, under normal conditions, well, I'll get into that in a bit. So far, kind of sort of apart from humans, no living organism has spread over the entire globe and become the dominant living thing in that environment. And you could also argue that humans haven't actually accomplished this either. There are natural limits to how big a population can get, and their growth occurs in phases. So like with humans, there are not one day going to be 100 billion humans, not living on Earth at least. It's just not possible. We couldn't grow that much food and have as the right amount of energy resources to provide these people health care and a roof and all of the things that they need to live, right? So the three kinds of the three growth stages are exponential growth, slowing of the growth rate, and a stabilization. So this has been documented with seals in Alaska before. So I don't know if they were just all killed off and then reintroduced, or if they were introduced there and had never lived there before. But we can see their population shot way up, but then eventually they stabilized at a point. Because if you have too many of yourself, you're just going to exhaust all of your food resources, and then the next generation, they have nothing to eat, so a lot of them die, and it's sort of a correction, right? So logistical growth is the pattern in nature where organisms, quote unquote, find their limit. It's a random process, and in my mind, it seems to be primarily based on the availability of food, right? Because it kind of all stems from that. And our final thing here is the concept of the carrying capacity. So that is the maximum number of individuals of a single species that can live in a single environment, right? So there are deer that live all over the country, like white-tailed deer. But the carrying capacity in, say, like Wyoming for white-tailed deer is going to be different than in South Dakota. Why not? Right? Because those are different environments. Same species, but different environment. Right? So there will be 2 more of these this week that we will take a look at. Hope you enjoyed that, and take care.